The scalpel felt heavy in her hand. Not because of fatigue, though the exhaustion was a constant, gnawing presence in the hollows of her bones. It felt heavy because of the man on her operating table. She was about to save the life of the person who had just ordered the destruction of her world. Every shell that screamed over the rooftops of Vukovar, every plume of smoke that marked another family home turned to rubble, every life extinguished in a flash of fire and shrapnel. It was all a consequence of his command. And now, his life was in her hands. I'm Serena, and today on Revenge Pains, we're diving into a story where healing and vengeance become one and the same. A story about a woman who refused to let the truth die in the ruins of her city. This is the story of Dr. Anna Kovacic, and it begins in the autumn of 1991, in the basement of Vukovar's besieged hospital, a place that had become a purgatory of concrete and disinfectant. The air in the makeshift operating theater was a thick cocktail of antiseptic, blood, and the omnipresent dust that filtered down from the pulverized floors above. Anna worked under the unsteady glare of a single bare bulb, powered by a generator that coughed and sputtered like a dying man. This man on her table was no different from the dozens she had treated that day, a mess of torn flesh and shattered bone. Except he was entirely different. This was Colonel Ratko Jovanovic of the Yugoslav People's Army, the architect of the siege. She had only seen him in propaganda photos, a man with a severe face and eyes that held the flat, placid emptiness of a predatory reptile. Now those eyes were closed, his face pale and slack with unconsciousness. Shrapnel from a stray mortar round, one of his own, in a bitter twist of irony, had torn through his abdomen. Without immediate surgery, he would die of internal bleeding. Her colleagues, the few surgeons who hadn't been killed or fled, had brought him to her. She was the best, the one with the steadiest hands, the one who could pull a life back from the brink when all hope was lost. Anna, Dr. Petrovic, her exhausted senior, had said, his voice a low rasp. It's him, Jovanovic. She had simply nodded, her expression unreadable as she pulled on a fresh pair of latex gloves. Her mind, however, was a maelstrom. This was the man whose artillery had killed her mentor, Dr. Varga, just last week. A kind, brilliant man vaporized while trying to retrieve a wounded child from the street. This was the man whose blockade was slowly starving the city, whose orders had turned her hospital from a place of healing into a charnel house. The Hippocratic oath, the sacred vow to treat the sick regardless of who they are, felt like a cruel joke. Her every instinct screamed to let him die, to let nature, or perhaps justice, take its course right here on her table. But as she made the first incision, a different thought began to form, cold and clear as ice. Killing him now would be an act of passion, a fleeting moment of satisfaction that would change nothing. He would become a martyr to his cause, and another officer would simply take his place. The shelling would continue. The dying would continue. No, his death was too simple, too easy. What she wanted was not revenge in its base, violent form. What she wanted was something more profound, something that would outlive him, outlive this war. She wanted justice. And as she worked meticulously to repair the damage to his body, a plan began to stitch itself together in her mind, a plan as intricate and precise as the sutures she was now laying. She saved his life. Her hands, guided by years of training and a surgeon's dispassionate focus, moved with an almost chilling efficiency. She clamped the bleeding arteries, removed the jagged piece of metal, and sutured the torn organs with the same care she would give to an innocent child. As she closed the final layer of skin, she looked at the man's still form. He would live. And in that moment, Anna Kovacic's mission was born. She would not be just a healer. She would become a collector of evidence, a silent witness, a weapon forged in the crucible of this hospital. She would use the very tools of her trade, her medical knowledge, her access, her meticulous nature, to dismantle the system of lies and impunity that allowed men like Jovanovic to thrive. He would not be judged by a stray piece of shrapnel. He would be judged by the world. And she, the doctor forced to save him, would be the one to deliver the evidence for his conviction. His recovery became the true inciting incident of her war. Jovanovic was given a private room in the relatively safer, deeper part of the basement, a VIP section in this hierarchy of suffering. Anna was assigned as his primary physician, a twisted reward for her skill. It was during these daily visits that her cold rage began to temper itself into a hard, diamond-like resolve. He was not a monster in the way she'd imagined. He was worse. He was a bureaucrat of death. "Doctor," he said one afternoon, his voice regaining its command even as he lay propped against thin pillows. "The generators are running low on fuel. I've had to divert the last shipment to my artillery batteries. Priority must be maintained." He said it so casually, as if discussing inventory. Anna's blood ran cold. That fuel was meant to power the incubators for the premature babies upstairs. "Colonel," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "without that fuel, the neonatal unit will lose power. Those infants will not survive the night." Jovanovic waved a dismissive hand. "A regrettable necessity of war, Doctor. Sacrifices must be made for the greater good of the nation. Your job is to handle the consequences. My job is to win the war." He looked at her, and there was no malice in his eyes, no sadistic glee. There was only a profound and terrifying apathy. The lives of those children were a logistical rounding error to him, a line item on a balance sheet of victory. It was in that moment that Anna understood the true nature of systemic evil. It wasn't the passionate hatred of a soldier on the front line. It was the cold, detached calculation of a man in an office, a man who sees human lives as abstract resources. Her revenge would have to be equally cold, equally methodical. She would turn his world of reports, records, and procedures against him. She would make the consequences he so easily dismissed impossible for the world to ignore. That night, she found what she was looking for in a dusty storage closet, an old Agfa compact camera left behind by a journalist in the early days of the siege. With it, she had a few precious rolls of microfilm. It was perfect. Small, easy to hide, capable of storing vast amounts of information. Her project began. Her days remained a grueling cycle of surgery and patient care, but her nights became something else entirely. She started meticulously documenting the atrocities that passed through her operating theater. This wasn't about patient charts. This was about building a case. When a child was brought in with the distinct, horrific wounds caused by illegal cluster munitions, small, star-shaped patterns of shrapnel designed to maim rather than kill, she photographed the injuries before surgery. She would hold a ruler next to the wounds for scale, her hands steady, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. She photographed the telltale chemical burns on the lungs of a family brought in from a shelled apartment block, the air in their basement thick with a strange, sweet smell. These were weapons banned by international convention, but here, in the darkness of Vukovar, all rules had been suspended. She couldn't write explicit notes. That would be a death sentence if discovered. So she devised a system, a code hidden within the mundane bureaucracy of the hospital itself. She used standard medical terminology to create a shadow record. A diagnosis of multiple punctures, foreign body ingress, stellate pattern, became her code for a cluster bomb victim. Acute respiratory distress syndrome, toxin-induced, was for chemical agents. To an outside observer, her notes were just the meticulous, if slightly obsessive, records of a dedicated surgeon. But to her, they were an indictment, a secret language of truth. Each file was a ghost, a voice she refused to allow to be silenced. Night after night, she would slip away to the records room, a stuffy, cramped space filled with shelves of manila folders, and amend the files. She was building her arsenal one piece of paper at a time. The camera and microfilm were the core of her evidence, but the coded paper trail was the key, the legend that would allow the world to decipher the images. It was Chekhov's gun, loaded with medical data, waiting for the final act. Now, I need you to really picture this moment, because what happens in the next 60 seconds will change everything. Anna felt she was in control, that her secret mission was proceeding as planned. But the war had a way of reminding you that you were never in control. The front line was not some distant thing. It was a hungry beast that could reach into the very heart of the hospital at any moment. The brutal reality of Colonel Jovanovic's casual decision about the fuel convoy came to a head a week later. A message was smuggled through the lines. A Red Cross convoy carrying antibiotics, anesthesia, and other critical supplies had been deliberately blocked and turned back by JNA forces under Jovanovic's direct command. They claimed it was carrying weapons for the Croatian defenders. It was a lie, a thin pretext for tightening the noose on the city, for letting disease and infection do the work of bullets and shells. That same afternoon, a 9-year-old girl named Lena was carried into the ER. She had a deep, gaping wound in her leg from a piece of shrapnel that had pinned her in the rubble of her home for 2 days. The wound was dirty, already showing the angry red signs of a severe bacterial infection. Under normal circumstances, it was a treatable injury. A heavy course of intravenous antibiotics would have fought back the infection, allowing Anna to clean and set the wound. But the hospital's supply of broad-spectrum antibiotics had run out 2 days ago. The Red Cross convoy was their only hope. Now, that hope was gone. Anna and Dr. Petrovic did everything they could. They irrigated the wound with the last of their sterile saline solution, packed it with what little antiseptic gauze they had left. But the infection was too aggressive. Gangrene began to set in, the flesh turning a sickly, mottled black, the smell of decay starting to emanate from the wound. Lena's fever spiked, her small body racked with septic shock. Anna stood by the girl's bedside, watching her life slip away. She could see the path ahead with horrifying clarity. They had one last, terrible option. "We have to amputate," Dr. Petrovic said, his voice heavy with defeat. He didn't need to say the rest. Amputation in these conditions, without the proper antibiotics to prevent post-operative infection, was a desperate gamble. But leaving the leg meant certain death from sepsis. Anna simply nodded, her jaw tight. She couldn't feel grief or sadness. Those emotions were a luxury she could no longer afford. What she felt was a cold, clarifying rage that burned away everything else. This was not a medical necessity. It was a sentence handed down by Colonel Jovanovic. He had blocked a convoy, and this little girl was going to lose her leg as a result. The surgery was a nightmare. They had to use a lower dose of anesthesia than was safe, conserving what little they had. Lena's small whimpers throughout the procedure were a haunting soundtrack to the grim work of the bone saw. Anna's movements were precise, mechanical. She was a machine performing a function. She cut through muscle, clamped vessels, and guided the saw through the femur with an unnerving steadiness. She refused to let her hands shake. She would not give Jovanovic that. After the surgery, as Lena lay in the recovery area, minus her right leg below the knee, Anna went to see the colonel for his daily checkup. He was sitting up in bed, reading a book. "Ah, doctor," he said, looking up. "Good news. My men have confirmed the convoy was indeed smuggling arms. My decision to turn it back has saved the lives of many of my soldiers." Anna stood there, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her white coat splattered with a few small, dark drops of Lena's blood. She thought of the bone saw. She thought of the girl's whimpers. She looked at this man, so comfortable in his certainty, so insulated from the consequences of his actions. "Colonel," she said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper, "I have just amputated the leg of a 9-year-old girl, an infection that was entirely treatable had we received the antibiotics on that convoy. You didn't save the lives of your soldiers. You simply traded a little girl's leg for your tactical advantage." Jovanovic's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't like being challenged. "War is about difficult choices, doctor. You see one girl, I see an entire military operation. You clearly lack the perspective to understand the burdens of command." "And you," Anna replied, stepping closer, "lack the humanity to bear them." She turned and walked out before he could respond, leaving him in a stunned silence. The line had been crossed. Her dispassionate mask had slipped. In that moment, she had let him see the contempt in her eyes, but she didn't care. The rage was no longer just fuel for her mission. It was becoming a part of her. The amputation of Lena's leg had amputated a part of Anna's own soul, the part that still clung to the idea of professional neutrality. Now, her mission was not just about justice. It was personal. This is where the story takes a turn I didn't see coming the first time I heard it. And I've heard a lot of revenge stories, because Anna, in her focused quest, wasn't entirely alone. There were small acts of quiet resistance all over that hospital. But as she was about to find out, any act of defiance, no matter how small, carried a lethal price tag. Among the hospital staff, there was a junior nurse, a young man named Ivan. He was barely out of his teens, with a kind face and eyes that still held a flicker of idealism in all this horror. He was quiet, efficient, and fiercely loyal to the hospital and its patients. Ivan had noticed Anna's late-night trips to the records room, her quiet intensity. He didn't know the details of her plan, but he knew she was doing something important, something more than just patching up wounds. He saw her as a symbol of defiance against the overwhelming despair. Ivan became her silent accomplice. He would procure supplies for her, not just medical supplies, but things she needed for her secret project. An extra roll of film from a forgotten drawer, chemicals for developing the microfilm from the old X-ray lab, a spare battery for her flashlight. He would leave them for her in a designated loose floorboard in a disused utility closet, never speaking a word about it. Their communication was in fleeting glances, small nods of understanding in the crowded, chaotic hallways. He was her lifeline, a quiet thread of support in her suffocating isolation. Anna knew the danger he was putting himself in, and she felt a constant, low-level anxiety for him. She tried once to warn him off, to tell him without words that he should stop. She cornered him in a quiet corridor, her eyes conveying the urgency. "Ivan," she began, but he just shook his head slightly, a small, sad smile on his face. "Someone has to keep the lights on, Doctor," he whispered, a reference to her flashlight and her work. "You are not alone." Then the worst happened. The JNA had local paramilitary allies, brutal, undisciplined thugs who roamed the occupied parts of the city. They were more dangerous than the regular soldiers because they were unpredictable, fueled by ideology and personal grudges. One of these units was tasked with sweeping the hospital for hostile elements and confiscating contraband. They found Ivan's stash. It wasn't much, just a few medical items and a couple of rolls of film. To the paramilitaries, it was evidence of hoarding and theft, but more than that, it was a sign of disobedience. It was a challenge to their authority. Anna was in the middle of a surgery when she heard the commotion. A loud argument in the hallway, the rough shouts of the paramilitaries, and then Ivan's voice trying to explain. She felt a bolt of pure, cold terror. She couldn't leave the patient on the table. She had to keep working, her hands moving automatically while her mind screamed. Then came the sound of a single gunshot, sharp and final, echoing through the concrete halls of the basement. An hour later, when she finally finished the surgery and stepped out, the hallway was quiet. Too quiet. She saw the looks on the faces of the other nurses. She saw the dark stain on the floor near the utility closet. They told her what happened. They had dragged Ivan out, accused him of being a spy for the Croatian forces, and executed him on the spot as an example. Anna walked to the small, curtained-off area that served as the morgue. Ivan's body lay on a gurney, covered by a thin sheet. She pulled it back. The single bullet hole in his forehead was neat, clinical. A professional execution. She stood there for a long time, the world receding to a dull hum. The cold rage that had been her shield and her fuel was now replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness. This was her fault. Her mission, her need for justice, had gotten this boy killed. The weight of his death almost broke her. For a full day, she went through the motions like an automaton. The camera and microfilm felt like poison in her hands. The risk wasn't abstract anymore. It had a face. It had a name. Ivan. But that night, sitting in the darkness, the sounds of shelling a distant drumbeat, something shifted inside her. Giving up now would make Ivan's sacrifice meaningless. It would be an insult to his memory. His death couldn't be for nothing. Her resolve hardened from diamond into something even stronger, something forged in guilt and loss. She would not stop. She would finish this, not just for the victims of the siege, but for the kind-faced boy who had believed in her. The lethal risk of her mission was now a certainty, and it no longer scared her. It focused her. She now understood, in a way she never had before, that this was a fight to the death. Either her evidence would see the light of day, or she would end up on a gurney next to Ivan. There was no in-between. In the midst of this deepening despair, a fragile thread of hope emerged from an unlikely source. The crackle of a shortwave radio. One of the old maintenance workers had managed to keep a small, battery-powered radio hidden, and at night, a small group would huddle around it, listening to the BBC World Service, desperate for any news from the outside world. The signal was faint, filled with static, but the clipped, British accent of the newsreader was a voice from another universe, a universe where order still existed. One night, a report cut through the static that made Anna's heart leap into her throat. The United Nations Human Rights Commission was escalating its response to the conflict. They would be sending a special rapporteur, a Cees van der Hoek, to investigate allegations of war crimes. Critically, he and his team were to be embedded with the next major UN-brokered evacuation convoy, which was scheduled to attempt to reach the Vukovar hospital in the coming weeks. This was it. Before this moment, her plan had been a desperate act of faith. She was collecting evidence with no clear idea of how she would ever get it out of the city. She had imagined sewing the microfilm into the lining of her coat, hoping to slip through the lines, a plan with a slim to none chance of success. But now she had a target, a name, Cees van der Hoek. She had a tangible objective: get the evidence to the UN rapporteur. The news gave her a desperate, terrifying timeline. The evacuation convoy was her only shot. If she missed it, if she was discovered before it arrived, if it was blocked like the Red Cross convoy, there would be no second chances. The sense of purpose that had been dulled by Ivan's death now returned with a vengeance, sharp and clear. Every action was now geared toward this one single goal. The pressure intensified from the other side as well. Colonel Jovanovic, now mostly recovered, was growing more mobile and more suspicious. He had seen the flash of contempt in her eyes and had not forgotten it. He was a man who understood threats, and he was beginning to see her not as a healer, but as something else he couldn't quite define. Her frequent late-night activity, which she had justified as checking on critical patients, was now drawing his attention. "You are very dedicated, doctor," he commented one evening, finding her in the corridor near the records room. "Or perhaps you suffer from insomnia." His eyes were sharp, probing. "In this place, Colonel," she replied coolly, "the only way to sleep is to be dead tired. I have work to do." But the encounter was a warning. The next day, she noticed a new face among the hospital orderlies, a hulking, silent man who seemed to have no specific duties but was always there. He would be sweeping a corridor she needed to use or organizing supplies in a closet she needed to access. His eyes would follow her, cold and watchful. He was one of Jovanovic's men, a loyalist placed there to be the colonel's eyes and ears. She was being watched. This new development turned her mission into a deadly cat-and-mouse game within the confined, crumbling walls of the hospital. She could no longer risk going to the records room. Her coded files were now inaccessible. She had to rely solely on the microfilm. She had to find a new, safe place to work, to document, to hide her precious camera and canister. She found it in the one place no one wanted to go, the basement morgue. It was a cold, damp concrete room 2 levels below the main basement, connected by a narrow, steep staircase. The bodies of the dead were laid out in rows, covered in sheets, their numbers growing every day. The air was frigid and smelled of death and formaldehyde. It was a place of ghosts and sorrow, but it was also the one place she could be truly alone. The loyalist orderly wouldn't follow her there. No one would. So the morgue became her sanctuary, her darkroom. She would wait until the deepest hours of the night, when the hospital fell into a fitful, exhausted lull, and slip down the stairs. Surrounded by the silent, sheet-covered forms of the victims whose stories she was trying to save, she worked. She developed the microfilm, her hands shaking in the acrid chemical baths, holding up the delicate strips to the light of her flickering flashlight to check the images. The faces of the dead stared back at her, their wounds a silent testimony. It was grim, horrific work, but in that tomb of a room, Anna felt closer to her purpose than ever. She was no longer just a doctor. She was the custodian of their memory. And the cat-and-mouse game with Jovanovic's watcher overhead only sharpened her senses, making her more careful, more precise, more determined to win. The end came suddenly, as it always does in war. The rhythmic, almost predictable thud of distant artillery had been the soundtrack to their lives for weeks. But one night, the sound changed. It became a constant, deafening roar. The shelling was no longer targeted. It was a blanket of fire, a final, brutal push to pulverize the last pockets of resistance. The tremors were so violent that dust and concrete rained down from the ceiling, and the single light bulb in the operating theater would flicker and die for minutes at a time. The city was falling. Anna knew her time had run out. The evacuation convoy, her last and only hope, was scheduled to arrive in the morning, assuming it could get through. The JNA would be taking full control of the hospital within hours. This would be her last night to complete her work. She grabbed her remaining undeveloped film and her camera and made her way toward the morgue for the final time. As she slipped through the darkened corridors, a new, terrifying sound reached her ears. The grinding, protesting groan of the hospital's main generators, followed by a sudden, profound silence. The emergency lights flickered on for a moment, then they too died, plunging the entire basement into an absolute, suffocating darkness. The last of the fuel was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her, but she pushed it down, her training and her mission taking over. She had a flashlight and she had candles. She would finish this. She made her way down the steep steps to the morgue. The darkness in there was a physical presence. It was a blackness so complete it felt like it had weight and texture. She lit a half-dozen candles, placing them carefully around the small, makeshift developing station she had created. The room flickered into a ghostly, dancing light, the shadows of the sheet-covered bodies leaping and twisting on the damp concrete walls. Above her, she could hear the symphony of the city's death, the unceasing roar of explosions, the rattle of heavy machine gun fire getting closer, the shouts of men. It was the sound of the world ending. And in that cavern of death, surrounded by flickering candles and the silent dead, Anna Kovacic worked. Her hands were steady as she processed the final roll of microfilm. Each image was a sin she was refusing to allow to be buried. With every frame she saved, she felt Ivan's presence, she felt Dr. Varga's presence, she felt the presence of every life that had been extinguished in this senseless slaughter. She was not just a doctor or an avenger. She was an archivist of truth, fighting her last battle against the coming darkness. She worked with a furious, desperate focus, racing against the sounds of the battle overhead, racing against the footsteps she knew would eventually come down those stairs. She had to finish before Jovanovic's men began their official evacuation of the facility. The city had fallen. By dawn, the roar of artillery had been replaced by the crackle of fires and the rumble of tanks in the streets. Then came a new sound, the heavy, booted footsteps of JNA soldiers echoing through the hospital's corridors. They were here. Led by the fully recovered and smugly triumphant Colonel Jovanovic, the soldiers began to systematically sweep the facility. Their movements were cold and efficient. They were separating the staff and patients, barking orders, their faces grim masks of authority. This wasn't a rescue, it was a processing. Anna knew what this meant. They were separating out the military-aged men, the hostile personnel, doctors and nurses who were too outspokenly Croatian, and anyone they deemed a threat. She knew that for many, this evacuation was a one-way trip. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. The UN convoy was her last chance, her only chance. It was parked outside, white trucks and blue helmets a stark, almost surreal contrast to the gray rubble and green JNA uniforms. It was her finish line. She had the evidence. A small, dense canister of microfilm, the culmination of weeks of secret, terrifying work. Now she had to get it out. Hiding it on her person was too risky. They were searching everyone. As she watched the soldiers methodically patting down her colleagues, an idea sparked. It was a desperate gamble, but everything was a gamble now. She slipped away into what was once the hospital library, now a wreck of overturned shelves and scattered books. She found what she was looking for. A thick, heavy medical textbook on surgical procedures. An old one with a sturdy, hollowable binding. With her scalpel, the same tool she'd used to save Jovanovic's life, she frantically, but precisely carved a small cavity into the dense pages of the book, a secret compartment just big enough for the microfilm canister. She placed the canister inside, a cold, heavy weight of condensed truth, and closed the book. It looked perfectly normal. Clutching the textbook to her chest, she walked back out into the main hall. The scene was one of organized chaos. UN officials, led by the rapporteur Cees van der Hoek, were arguing with Jovanovic. The air was thick with tension. Then Jovanovic saw her. He broke off his argument and strode directly toward her, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. The loyalist orderly was at his side. "Doctor," Jovanovic said, his voice dangerously soft. Always the diligent one, even at the end of the world. What do you have there? He gestured to the book. Just a textbook, Anna replied, her voice miraculously steady. She held his gaze, her heart pounding a deafening rhythm in her ears. I thought it might be useful. Knowledge should be preserved, even when everything else is lost. He smiled, a cold, thin-lipped expression that didn't reach his eyes. A noble sentiment, but your loyalty has always been questionable. You care more for these traitors than for the good of the nation. He was testing her, probing for a reaction. This was the moment. Her mind raced, searching for an escape. As Jovanovic was momentarily distracted by a UN soldier shouting for his attention, Anna saw her chance. It was a sliver of an opportunity, a heartbeat of chaos she had to create herself. With a sudden, deliberate movement, she let the heavy medical textbook slip from her grasp. At the same time, she pivoted and swept her arm across a nearby metal trolley laden with the last of the hospital's precious surgical instruments. The effect was instantaneous and explosive. The textbook hit the concrete floor with a heavy thud, but the tray of instruments went flying, crashing to the ground with a deafening, metallic shriek. Glass vials shattered, scalpels and forceps skittered across the floor, a cascade of valuable, irreplaceable equipment scattering in every direction. It was an act of medical sacrilege. In a place where a single clean scalpel was worth more than gold, the sound of its destruction was more shocking than a gunshot. Every head turned. The soldiers, the UN staff, even Jovanovic, everyone flinched at the sound. In that single, perfect moment of stunned chaos, Anna bent down, ostensibly to retrieve her fallen book. But her eyes were locked on a large, open-topped cardboard box filled with medical records, patient charts, administrative files, that was being loaded onto one of the UN trucks by the rapporteur's aides. Her movements were a fluid, rehearsed motion. As she picked up her own book, she took 2 quick, silent steps, and with the practiced grace of a surgeon, she slipped the hollowed-out textbook into that box, burying it among the sea of mundane manila folders. She straightened up just as Jovanovic turned back to her, his face a mask of fury. What is the meaning of this? Are you insane? That equipment. An accident, Colonel, she said, her voice laced with a feigned, breathless panic. I'm so sorry, I'm just so tired. He stared at her, his eyes burning with suspicion, but the diversion had worked. The UN rapporteur, Mr. van der Hoek, was now at his side, his face grim. Colonel, my mandate is to evacuate these records as part of my investigation. Your men are interfering. As the 2 men resumed their argument, their voices rising, Anna's eyes met van der Hoek's over Jovanovic's shoulder. It was a fleeting glance, no more than a second. But in that second, something passed between them, an unspoken question in her eyes and a flicker of something in his. Was it understanding? She couldn't be sure. But he had seen her place the book in the box. He had seen the entire, strange sequence of events. He didn't nod, he didn't give any sign, but his gaze held hers just long enough. It was enough. She had done it. The fuse was lit. The evidence was on its way out, hidden in plain sight, a Trojan horse made of paper and truth. Now all she had to do was survive. The months that followed were a blur of gray anonymity. Anna ended up in a refugee camp in Austria, a sprawling, muddy city of tents and prefabricated containers. The immediate, life-or-death tension of the siege was gone, but it was replaced by a different kind of purgatory. She was gaunt, haunted by the faces of the dead and the ever-present memory of Ivan's execution. The cold, purposeful rage that had sustained her had receded, leaving behind a hollow, aching trauma. She was just another survivor, one of thousands with a story of loss etched onto her soul. She did her best to disappear, to become invisible. She kept to herself, her days marked by the monotonous routine of the camp, queuing for food, queuing for water, staring at the barbed wire fence that enclosed their new reality. The silence was the hardest part. After the constant noise of the war, the quiet of the camp felt unnatural, deafening. It gave her too much time to think, too much time to remember. The only thing that kept the sliver of hope alive was the memory of that final, chaotic moment in the hospital. Had the book made it? Had Van der Hoek understood? Or had her desperate gamble been for nothing? The uncertainty was a constant, gnawing acid in her stomach. One cold, damp evening, she was huddled in the camp's common area, where an old radio played the BBC World Service. Mostly, she tuned it out. But then, a few words cut through the static and seized her attention. Unprecedented leak of medical evidence from the besieged Croatian city of Vukovar. Anna froze, her heart stopping. The British announcer continued, his voice crisp and clear. Sources say the evidence, which includes highly detailed photographic documentation and coded medical notes, allegedly details systematic war crimes, including the use of illegal munitions on civilian populations. This leak has prompted the newly formed International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, to launch a formal investigation. The names of several high-ranking JNA officers are reportedly at the top of their preliminary indictment list. Anna closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel something other than grief or fear. It was a feeling of profound, trembling relief. It had worked. The book had made it. Her ghosts were beginning to speak. A few weeks later, a man in a formal suit, looking starkly out of place in the mud and despair of the camp, came looking for her. He introduced himself as an investigator from The Hague. He was polite, his eyes holding a quiet intensity. He led her to a private trailer, away from the prying eyes of the other refugees. "Dr. Anna Kovacic?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She nodded mutely. He opened a briefcase and took out a single, glossy photograph. He slid it across the table toward her. It was an 8x10 enlargement of one of her own microfilm images. It showed the distinct, star-shaped shrapnel wounds on the leg of a young boy. A ruler she had placed next to the wound was clearly visible. It was irrefutable. "This, along with the rest of your work, has found its way to us," the investigator said softly. "It is the most comprehensive and damning body of evidence we have received from this conflict. Your coding system for the patient files was ingenious. We have broken it. We know what it all means." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "The name at the top of our indictment list, the man whose command is linked to the majority of these atrocities, is Colonel Ratko Jovanovic." He looked at her, his expression serious. "Your evidence is the foundation of our case against him. But to make it unbreakable, we need the person who collected it. We need the expert who can explain to the court precisely what these images mean, what these medical codes signify. We need you to testify." He pushed another document across the table. It was a formal summons from the ICTY. "Dr. Kovacic," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Are you willing to see this through to the end?" Anna looked at the photograph of the boy's wounds. She thought of Ivan. She thought of Dr. Varga. She thought of Lena, the little girl who lost her leg. She thought of the countless others whose faces she had documented in candlelight, surrounded by the dead. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet, but as solid as bedrock. "Yes," she said, "I am." Years passed. The world moved on, but justice moves at its own deliberate pace. The courtroom at The Hague was a world away from the dust and blood of the Vukovar hospital. It was a place of polished wood, quiet intensity, and international law. Anna Kovacic sat on the witness stand. She was no longer the gaunt, haunted refugee from the Austrian camp. She wore a simple, professional suit, her hair was neatly tied back, and her face, though still bearing the faint lines of past trauma, was composed and resolute. She had retrained, rebuilt her life, but she had never forgotten her promise. For days, she had been on the stand, her testimony the linchpin of the prosecution's case. She spoke with the calm, clinical precision of the surgeon she was. She didn't use emotive language. She didn't speak of her rage or her grief. She simply presented the facts. "Exhibit 117B, she said, her voice clear and steady, resonating through the silent courtroom. A photo flashed on the large screens, one of her photos, showing the lungs of a victim discolored by chemical agents. "This image shows classic signs of phosgene gas poisoning. Note the pulmonary edema and the damage to the alveolar membranes. This is not consistent with smoke inhalation. This is the signature of a chemical weapon." She moved on to the next piece of evidence, and the next. She explained her coded notes, translating the medical jargon into a horrifying narrative of systematic violence. Multiple punctures, foreign body ingress, stellate pattern, she explained, was the term I used to document wounds from cluster munitions, like the ones that killed the family in the basement of Building 27. Across the courtroom, in the glass-fronted dock for the accused, sat Ratko Jovanovic. He was older, grayer, his military uniform replaced by a civilian suit. He had spent the entire trial projecting an air of indignant defiance. But now, as Anna's cool, precise testimony piled fact upon damning fact, his composure was beginning to crack. He was a man drowning in a sea of irrefutable data. He could argue against accusations of hatred. He could dismiss stories of sorrow. But he couldn't argue with a medical textbook. He couldn't refute a chemical analysis. Finally, the prosecutor asked her about the defendant. "Dr. Kovacic, do you see the man responsible for these atrocities in the courtroom today?" Anna turned her head and looked directly at Ratko Jovanovic. For the first time, their eyes met across the sterile space of the court. He glared at her, a look of pure, undiluted hatred on his face. He saw the woman who had defied him, the woman who had brought his world crashing down. But what he saw in her eyes was not the reflection of his own hate. There was no rage there, no personal animosity, no satisfying gleam of victory. She looked at him with the cool, dispassionate finality of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. Her expression was one of sober, quiet certainty. It was the look of a problem identified, an illness diagnosed, and a procedure completed. Her vindication wasn't in his downfall, but in the methodical triumph of the truth. It was in the quiet, relentless ticking of the international justice she had set in motion with a second-hand camera and a hollowed-out book. She had not destroyed him with violence, but with his own cold logic, turning evidence and procedure into a weapon more powerful than any artillery shell. She had done what she set out to do. She had made the world see. So in the end, Anna Kovacic never laid a hand on Colonel Jovanovic. She never had to. Her revenge wasn't a dish served cold. It was a diagnosis delivered with crushing, irrefutable precision. Jovanovic was found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to life in prison, buried under a mountain of evidence she had single-handedly compiled in the dark. You know, when I first heard this story, I thought it was just about revenge. But the more I think about it, the more I realize it's about reclaiming power and truth in a situation where you have none. Anna's journey wasn't just about getting even, it was about getting free. Free from the helplessness and free from the weight of all those silenced voices. What makes this story so powerful to me isn't just the victory, but the method. It's a testament to the idea that the truth, when weaponized correctly, can be more powerful than any army. Anna didn't just find justice. She manufactured it out of data, courage, and an unbreakable will. I'd love to hear what you think down in the comments. Is this justice, or is it a form of revenge that transcends violence? It's a complicated question, and I'm genuinely curious to hear your take on it. I'm Serena, and if this story resonated with you, and you want to hear more stories about the long, difficult road to vindication, make sure to subscribe to Revenge Pains. Thank you for being here and listening. I'll see you in the next story.